He stood in the Kremlin and watched the greatest city in Russia burn. He had marched 600,000 men across Europe to get here. He had fought through summer heat, disease, and a scorched countryside that offered nothing to eat. He had won the most brutal battle of his entire career, and now he stood in Moscow, the prize, the goal, the city whose capture was supposed to end the war, and it was on fire. The Russians had burned it themselves, and they were not coming to surrender. Napoleon stood at that window for 6 days, and in those 6 days, the most powerful general in history made the decision that ended his empire. This is not the story of a great man defeated by winter. That is the version they teach in schools. The truth is more disturbing. Napoleon was not destroyed by the cold. He was destroyed by a trap he walked into with his eyes open and then refused to walk back out of until it was too late. In 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte controlled the largest empire in European history. He had defeated Austria, Prussia, Spain, Portugal, and every coalition the great powers could assemble against him. Only Britain remained unconquered, protected by the English Channel and the Royal Navy. To strangle Britain economically, Napoleon had created the continental system, a blockade that required every European nation to refuse British trade. It was working, slowly, painfully, but working. And then Tsar Alexander I of Russia walked away from it. Russia needed British trade. Its economy depended on it. In 1810, Alexander quietly reopened Russian ports to British goods. Napoleon sent warnings. Alexander ignored them. And Napoleon made the decision that would define the rest of his life. He would invade Russia and force the Tsar back into line. The plan was not insane. Napoleon had built his entire career on the same formula: march fast, force a decisive battle, destroy the enemy army, dictate terms. He had done it a dozen times. He had humiliated Russia at Austerlitz in 1805. He had met Alexander personally on a raft in the middle of a river to negotiate peace after crushing him at Friedland in 1807. He knew how to beat Russia. He had done it before. What he did not know was that Russia had learned from those defeats, and this time they were not going to fight him the way he wanted. On June 24, 1812, the Grande Armée crossed the Niemen River into Russia. 615,000 men, the largest military force ever assembled in European history. Napoleon expected a decisive battle within weeks. The Russians retreated. They retreated at every point of contact. They burned their crops. They poisoned their wells. They destroyed anything that could feed or supply a French army. General Barclay de Tolly understood something that Napoleon's ego would not allow him to accept: that the fastest way to destroy the Grande Armée was not to fight it, but to make it chase an army that kept moving, while the Russian landscape ate it alive. The summer of 1812 was brutally hot. French soldiers marching through scorched villages found nothing to eat and nothing to drink. Horses died by the thousands from exhaustion and lack of fodder. Disease, typhus, dysentery spread through the densely packed columns faster than any Russian bullet. By the time the Grande Armée reached Smolensk in mid-August, Napoleon had already lost nearly 200,000 men, not to combat, to disease, starvation, and the sheer brutal geography of Russia. He kept moving. He kept moving because stopping meant admitting the campaign was already failing. He kept moving because every general who had ever faced Napoleon knew that his greatest weapon was speed, and now he was using that speed to march deeper and deeper into a country that had already decided not to fight him on his terms. And then, on September 7th, the Russians finally turned and fought. The Battle of Borodino was fought 120 kilometers from Moscow on a single day that produced more casualties than any other day of the Napoleonic Wars. 300,000 men on a single field, 12 hours of continuous fighting. By nightfall, approximately 30,000 French soldiers and 45,000 Russians were dead or wounded. Napoleon won the field. Kutuzov, the Russian commander who had replaced Barclay, retreated. The road to Moscow was open. Napoleon had his victory, and it solved nothing. The Russian army was still intact, still retreating, still refusing to surrender. Napoleon had shed more blood than at any battle of his career, and the enemy had simply stepped back and kept walking. But Moscow was 7 days away, and Moscow was going to change everything. On September 14th, 1812, Napoleon entered Moscow. He rode to the Kremlin and waited. He waited for the city leaders to come and present the keys. He waited for Tsar Alexander to send peace envoys. He waited for the formal surrender that was supposed to follow a successful campaign. Nobody came. Instead, just after midnight, he was told that fires had broken out across the city. He went to the Kremlin and watched. The fires grew. Strange reports came in. Russians were being caught starting the fires deliberately. Moscow's own governor, Count Rostopchin, had ordered the city burned rather than let it serve as a French base. Within hours, the firestorm was so intense that Napoleon was forced to flee the Kremlin down burning streets, nearly overcome by smoke, to reach safety at the city's outskirts. Moscow burned for 6 days. When the fires finally died, 3/4 of the city was ash. Napoleon moved back into what remained of the Kremlin and waited for Alexander to surrender. The Tsar watched his ancient capital burn and wrote in a letter that it illuminated his soul. He was not going to negotiate. He was not going to surrender. He was going to wait. Napoleon sent 3 separate letters to Alexander asking for peace talks. None received a reply. And here is the decision that ended the empire. Napoleon sat in the ruins of Moscow for 35 days. 35 days in which his army, already reduced from 600,000 to barely 100,000 combat-effective troops, ate through the last of their supplies, watched morale collapse, and waited for a peace that was never going to come. Every day Napoleon waited was a day the Russian winter moved closer. Every day he waited was a day Kutuzov's army grew stronger in its camps to the south. His generals begged him to leave. He had arrived in Moscow with perhaps 6 weeks of supplies remaining and a campaign season measured in weeks, not months. The window for a safe retreat was already closing. Napoleon waited. On October 19th, 5 weeks after entering Moscow, with the first frosts already arriving, Napoleon finally ordered the retreat. He left with approximately 110,000 men. He had entered Russia with 615,000. The retreat became a catastrophe. Kutuzov's army shadowed the French column constantly, cutting off stragglers and destroying rearguard units. Cossack cavalry appeared without warning to raid supply wagons. The army that had been the terror of Europe was now a column of hollow-eyed men in rags, burning their own equipment to stay warm, eating horses that had died on the road. The first significant snowfall did not arrive until November 6th, 3 weeks into the retreat. By that point, Napoleon had already lost the campaign. The cold finished what starvation and disease had started, but it was not the cause. Most of the Grande Armée's losses came before the first snowfall. At the Berezina River in late November, the remnants of the Grande Armée faced destruction. Russian armies had closed off the crossing and destroyed the bridge. French engineers worked in freezing water for 2 days to build makeshift crossings, while Cossacks attacked from both banks. Thousands drowned or were killed trying to cross. When Napoleon burned the bridges behind him, he left 10,000 stragglers trapped on the eastern bank. On December 8th, Napoleon left what remained of his army and rode back to Paris. 6 days later, the Grande Armée finally escaped Russian territory. Of the 615,000 men who had crossed the Neman River in June, fewer than 100,000 returned. 380,000 were dead. 120,000 were prisoners. Napoleon reached Paris and immediately began raising a new army. He still had France. He still had allies. He still had the genius that had made him the greatest commander in European history. But he no longer had the myth of invincibility. Every nation that had feared him, Prussia, Austria, the German states, now saw what Russia had seen. That Napoleon could be beaten, not in one great battle, but by refusing to fight him on his terms, by trading space for time, by letting the weight of an overextended empire slowly crush itself. Within 2 years, Napoleon was in exile on the island of Elba. Within 3 years, he was defeated at Waterloo and exiled again, this time permanently to the island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, where he died in 1821. He spent his final years dictating his memoirs, justifying the campaign, blaming the weather that had actually arrived after most of the damage was done, blaming his marshals, and blaming the Tsar for refusing to negotiate. He never fully answered the question that history keeps asking. Why did you wait 35 days in Moscow? 600,000 men crossed that river. Fewer than 100,000 came back. And the decision that killed them was not made in battle. It was made in the ruins of a burning city by the greatest general in the world, who could not accept that winning had not been enough. If this made you see how even the greatest empires fall, not from one catastrophic defeat, but from one catastrophic refusal to accept reality, subscribe to History Brief. Every video on this channel goes deeper than the version of history you were taught.